This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. Happy to say that I'm talking to Ray Murphy, who has not only played Score Sheet for a long time, but he is now one of the two managing directors of Baseball HQ, or bbhq.com. How are you today, Ray?
I'm great, Jeff. Happy New Year, and thanks for the invite to join you here.
Good. Well, we were talking offline for a minute about, last time I saw Ray was a couple months ago in the Arizona Fall League when Baseball HQ puts on a seminar kind of centered around the Arizona Fall League, which is always pretty much my favorite weekend of the year. Get a couple hundred people down there to watch games, go to seminars, and I want to thank you again for doing that every year.
Absolutely. It's one of, if not the single favorite weekend of the year for me, too. So it's certainly a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun, and feedback we get is great. Everybody just loves it so much. It takes a lot to put it together, but it's very much worthwhile because you're not the only person who says that weekend is near and dear to their heart. So it's, I guess the term we're looking for is it's a labor of love.
Yeah, well, I don't tell my wife it's one of my favorite weekends since she doesn't go, but yeah.
I should learn not to do that because I do it and I get in trouble.
Yeah, no, it's best to not tell your wife how wonderful just being with a bunch of guys, because it is kind of a guy's weekend. And then the other thing we talked about, you guys have put your 27-year now running book, I think, The Baseball Forecaster, went to bed a few weeks ago, and now folks like myself have been getting them in the mail.
Yes, the Forecaster went to bed right before Thanksgiving, and it's now in people's hands. A lot of people, from what I saw on social media, got it under their Christmas tree. Like you said, it's actually our 29th edition. We're building up to the big 30th next year. It's out. It's available on our website, and I'm not quite sure if it's dropped on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but that usually happens early in the year. But you can certainly come to our website, get it directly, and available on paper, of course. And if you order it from us, you get the PDF edition for free, which is super darn handy because I am looking at it right now, and it's a lot easier to look things up online than it is to flip through a paper book while I'm talking to you,
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of an old guy that likes paper, but the fact is carrying smartphones and laptops and mini iPads and all that stuff around to look at things is kind of nice. And then the book, that's just the starting point. You, of course, update all the player projections and playing time projections and everything else. Gets updated on your website pretty much every day from now to the end of the season, doesn't it?
That's right. We take great care with the book to try to not write things that are going to be out of date by the time people get their hands on them, because we developed the projections and the player analyses, back in October, and that's before any of the player movement and anything. So we focus on people's skills and trends and that sort of thing that shouldn't be affected by their environment. But then now that, as you say, now that we get through the winter meetings and all the player movement has happened, our website is the perfect place to update that information every day. So our projections are also up and online now. We posted those right before the holidays. We'll be tweaking and adjusting those, day over day, pretty much every day right through the end of the season. So, and that's, projections are, of course, just the tip of the iceberg too. Everybody wants the projections, but, we do a whole bunch of analysis of the players, of the projections, of gaming strategy, how to win at Score Sheet, how to exploit Score Sheet, or any other format you play in. So, we like to think that we've got something for everybody.
Yeah, you guys do a good mix of having text blurbs and then, well, you've always been cutting edge as far as numbers. You guys have, over the years, well, one of the things I always liked was kind of your risk factor, where you combine some things to say, yeah, this good guy could be great, but by the way, when you're talking about Tulowitzki or somebody, there's this huge risk factor. And you guys have really incorporated it in to where it's pretty easy for someone like me that's trying to decide whether I should draft somebody or trade for them to see how risky they really are.
It doesn't take a lot of complex algorithms to tell you that Troy Tulowitzki is probably going to get hurt.
Right.
But your point is very well taken that, everyone kind of goes through these stages in a, career of playing fantasy baseball that, you walk away from your draft in February or March or April and opening day comes and you feel like you've got this awesome team and, it doesn't come together, or the team just, ends up turning into a dumpster fire and you weren't expecting it at all. And you go through that enough times and then you start to try to quantify what went wrong, and that leads you to developing things like risk factors and incorporating injury history, and not just injury history, but just, performance volatility. You can pick a guy, like, to go back a couple of years, an example of a guy like Alex Rios, who you just never knew what you were going to get from season to season or half season to half season. It would seem like the light bulb would go on and off like it was just flickering. And, that kind of volatility, if you're in a situation in the early rounds of a Score Sheet draft where you want to get somebody who is going to be a foundation contributor, there are guys who meet that description and guys who just don't.
If you just look at 1 year's worth of stats for guys, you can really get burned pretty badly. Of course, there aren't a million Albert Pujolses out there, but it is nice to have some hope that a guy can repeat his good numbers from last year.
What a lot of our metrics do is try to get around. We actually, call when you were just talking about recency bias and try to get to, identify guys with stable long-term track records who you have a very good idea what you're going to get from them. And of course, the cost matters too. In the early rounds of a draft, you want to get those stable guys, but later on, you're willing to throw some darts and take some shots and take a guy who looks like he's got, some skills or had one good season or one good month and, then stunk the rest of the time. But you're like, oh, well, maybe that was enough that he'll break out and go to another level. And after round 30 in a score sheet draft, hey, that's fine. Anybody who's got any reason that look like they might be useful, I'll take a shot at them.
Yeah. Well, I think a key to winning at fantasy is to identify those guys in, say, round 16 or 17 when you've got your starters and you're looking for a guy that might really outperform his draft round. That's how you win when you draft a guy that makes an all-star team and you get him in round 22. So along those lines, I know last year we were talking about that fairly new metric you guys came up with of percentage of swinging strikes that a pitcher generates.
Last year was the first time we had that metric in the baseball forecaster. It's essentially the percentage of swinging strikes against all swings. Or is it all pitches? I forgot. I believe it's all pitches. Point being that a pitcher's ability to get swings and misses is a more reliable indicator of strikeout rate than the ability to get the umpire to call, strike three on the black on the outside corner for you consistently. The guys who have enough stuff to blow things by hitters or to fool hitters are the ones that are going to have higher strikeout rates. So we did a bunch of research when we got access to this data and found out that kind of what I just said doesn't just make logical sense, but is actually borne out by the numbers. Once we proved that the data was valuable, we threw it into the forecaster, kind of ran a bunch of charts where, we run people's swinging strike rate right next to their actual K per 9 rate. And when you start to see variances in those numbers, it can start to tell you guys who are primed to improve their strikeout rate or maybe have it fall. The guy who was really the poster child for that last year until he wrecked his knee, unfortunately, was Garrett Richards, who was really just the guy who swinging strikes said he was getting a ton of swinging strikes and wasn't necessarily turning them into strikeouts. But if he figured out how to do that, he was going to become a lot better fast. And that's exactly what happened for 4.5 and 5 months of last year before he wrecked his knee, which ruined a bunch of my fantasy seasons because I had him in a whole bunch of places and then I didn't have him for the score sheet playoffs, which killed me. So I'm not bitter or anything, just so we're clear.
No, that's the one problem with having a guy that breaks out and then when he gets hurt September 1st, you're kind of sad. But that sounds like a good tool because, that's the thing about projections. You got to kind of somehow get out the things that maybe the guy was just lucky and try to go on their base skills, which is what I think Ron and now you guys have always concentrated on as a player's base skills, not so much their results.
That's right. And, we're coming to a point now in the game where there's just so much data that, 10 years ago, getting at any sort of additional information, we would go, 10 years ago, HQ was giving their readers an edge by saying things like we shouldn't look at a batter's batting average. We should look at their walk to strikeout ratio and their strikeouts per at bat, their contact rate. And, 10, 12 years ago, that was fairly cutting edge, and that gave people, a decided edge in trying to identify players. Now, there have been so many data advances that you almost have a whole different problem, that there's so much data, you don't actually know what to use and what not to. You can dive into those rabbit holes and spend all day on them. So kind of what we're focused on now is trying to zero in on the places like this swinging strike rate where we can prove that there's some value in the data. And there's all sorts of stuff that's got a lot of sizzle and is interesting, but doesn't necessarily have, applications for building better fantasy teams, or at least we haven't figured them out yet. That's where we try to draw the line. And when we crack things like that, the swinging strike rate that I was talking about, that's when we kind of make the decision that we're going to hang our hats on this, and it goes in the book and you find it on the website and all that stuff.
No, it's no longer true that if you just use on-base percentage and somebody else in your league uses batting average, that you've got an edge. But I think you touched on a point. There's so many stats out there. You have to choose ones that aren't really small sample sizes. You can say, what does this guy do on a low curveball on a 1-2 count that's 6 inches outside the strike zone? Well, you might get a percentage of what he hits on those, but he might only see 13 of those pitches all year long.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The danger with data like that is we now have the ability to slice it down 37 times like that to get to the exact split that you were just talking about, but it may not be meaningful in 13 at bats. So maybe the guy just, happened to see all those pitches on days when he was hungover or something. Who knows?
Yeah, so that's your Kind of your most advanced pitcher stat. Is there a hitter stat you're looking to use this year that maybe give you an edge over people that are still 3 years behind the time?
Hitters are tough because I feel like the bar's sort of been set there for a while. The skill set that we look at is a little more stagnant. The new item that we have in the forecaster this year for hitters is sort of a not a new metric altogether, but it's sort of a combination of two that we've used before. Contact rate, which I was talking about earlier, which is basically just essentially the percentage of the time you don't strike out. And we've combined that with some of the cooler data you have for hitters these days is measuring the quality of contact. So you get, hard hit balls, medium hit balls, soft hit balls. You can actually slice it further than that, but you kind of get to the point where you're like, who cares? You call it hard, medium, and soft. So what we did was Patrick Davitt from our staff, who hosts our own podcast, Baseball HQ Radio, a couple of years back, took that hard hit ball data and combined it with the contact ratio to come up with the percentage of times you hit the ball hard, which tends to correlate very well with power, as you might expect, and line drives and batting average and all kinds of good things for hitters. So, I don't know that it's quite the sort of silver bullet that I was jumping up and down about with swing strike rate over the last year, but, in a world where you've got all of this data where you sort of don't know what to make of it or what weights to put on so many different and sometimes conflicting elements, that's one I'm zeroing in on. Is we call it HCTX, hard contact index. And it's pretty cool. It's one of those things where, once we calculated it the first time, we sort of ordered everybody from top to bottom. This was a year or two ago. And like at the top of the list were people you'd expect to see, like, Jose Bautista and Pujols and those sorts of things. And down at the bottom was like Chris Getz. And you're like, okay, yeah, that seems like it's telling me something.
Well, the good news is for those of us who just kind of want to read the book or look at the website, you don't really have to memorize 500 different pitchers' swinging strike rates because you folks incorporate all these things into your projections and even your cheat sheets and all. So a reader can spend as much time as they want kind of learning all the little nitty gritty. Or if they're in a hurry, they can just see whether you rank Max Scherzer ahead or behind John Lester, and we'll leave it kind of up to you as to why.
That's exactly right. You can, our sort of philosophy is we tend to be open source and we'll show you all the work that we do. And, our formulas are published and you can, take them and tweak them and do whatever you want with them yourself. And it's sort of a whole teach you how to fish thing rather than just hand you the fish. But if it's the night before your draft and you just need the fish, yeah, we've got that too. You can just come on and, like you said, print out cheat sheets or put in your league's categories and scoring system or, put in what statistics you want to focus on in your score sheet team. And we'll print out lists for you that you can take to your draft or put into your score sheet queue or what have you.
Well, that's another excellent thing about BBHQ for us score sheet players is that, magazines forever used to come up with cheat sheets that were ranked by dollar values that had virtually no use for score sheet players. In fact, because of steals and pitcher wins and things, they were almost bad if somebody read them. With BBHQ, I used to just sort players by VORP, value over replacement. If I was in a real hurry in March when I was just too busy setting up leagues to prepare for my own draft, I'd just sort by VORP, and I always came in the top 3 in the league just pretty much using that.
Yeah, I do something similar, maybe a half step more complicated than that. I'll go in for my score sheet leagues and I create a ranking system that focuses on on base and slugging for hitters and strikeout per 9 and ERA for pitchers just in our projections. But then I'll throw in an element of, I'll treat at bats and innings pitched as adding additional weight essentially so that I don't end up with like a bunch of relievers and, part-time middle infielders and stuff like that. But it ends up with a nice clean little sheet and I can go right down it and cross off all the guys at the top are usually the guys who are kept in my leagues. And I can see very quickly who the top guys are available at each position, which is what I need to know. Cause then I know, okay, well, I'm going into my score sheet league without I'm not keeping a third baseman this year or whatever. And, I better get this guy in round 14 or the other one might fall to round 17. That's the kind of information I need. And I can punch it out in our draft guide tool on the website in, a minute or two.
Yeah, that's good. So as a longtime score sheet guy, do you go into a draft thinking, okay, this is a year I'm going to load up on starting pitching or relief pitching or power bats or on base, or do you kind of go with the draft as it goes?
It's funny. I kind of go with the draft as it goes. You were talking about, it might have been offline, we were talking about so many of your customers being in keeper leagues. A keeper league team takes on its identity over time, right? And I sort of feel like my keeper league teams sort of kind of look the same going into every season. I don't have the same 13 keepers every year, but 6, 7, 8 of them might be the same guys that I've had for 3, 4, 5 years now. So the team kind of has a sort of a character, and I end up inevitably trying to fill in around that. I say that because it's interesting, because I just joined a new score sheet league this year for the first time in probably a decade. I have 2 leagues I've played in forever, and I just added a third one to my repertoire like last week. So it's kind of like it's inheriting a keeper league team, but it's kind of a blank canvas situation, and then I have keepers, but there's nobody I have any identity with. This team has no character as far as I'm concerned with. So I get to think about questions like what you're talking about, like how do I want to build this team? And it's funny because related to that, one of the things I learned from the guy who won one of my other leagues this year is he essentially, I don't want to say he won his league with defense, but he won in the playoffs because he had an absurdly good defense. And he's done it before, and he didn't have the best record going into the playoffs. He didn't have the best pitching, but in every game of the playoffs, he was running a defense that was like plus 40, plus 45. And it worked really, really well. So if I'm thinking about building a new score sheet keeper league team in this new league I joined, like one of the things I want to do is I actually want to pay a little more attention than I usually do to defense.
Well, I think along with defense is the kind of player you get. That the guys who are hitting 40 home runs, if there are any of those left, they're not usually the guys that have great defense. So it's not just the defense, but also in the playoffs, I think there's some value to being able to manufacture one run, because most of our playoff games are very close. They're between two good teams with good pitchers going, good starters, good relievers. And if you have the kind of guys that are good with defense, they're usually the kind of guys that can steal a base, or the kind of team that just kind of strings together a couple of hits and a stolen base and a fast guy that'll score from second on a single. And that can be more successful than waiting around for a 3-run homer when you're facing, Kershaw, who's not going to give up the 3-run homer.
Exactly. The kind of pitching you face in the playoffs, that 3-run homer just is not going to come. So you got to do other things. I totally agree with you. It's a good point. The defense and the speed and the contact ability and the ability to score from second and the ability to not make errors are all they all kind of intertwine. And it's even though I've been playing score sheet for a long time, I think what this whole episode reminded me of is I think it's something that I still kind of undervalue.
I mean, that was kind of the point of that Moneyball thing. It wasn't so much that the A's wanted on-base guys. What they really wanted to do was draft wherever there was an inefficiency in the major league market or make trades. And I think the same thing's true in score sheet. If you're in a league that undervalues relief pitchers, you can draft relief pitchers in the draft and put together an awesome staff. Or if you're in a league that greatly overvalues prospects, which we have a ton of leagues where people will give up their whole team for some prospect, it seems like. You draft prospects because you know that in April and May you can trade them for whatever you need.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of my leagues, the first year we did this is like the late 90s at this point. The first year we started the league and did the full, keeper league draft from scratch. The guy who won the league the first year, every guy he drafted was over age 30. Because all the other 9 of us were all falling over each other for that shortstop in Double-A we read an article about in whatever magazine, and taking them way too early. Meanwhile, this guy just sat here like cherry picking veterans who were all hitting 20 home runs and with decent on base percentages and number 3 starters with solid numbers, and he won the league while we were all just totally chasing sizzle.
Yeah, and as they say, flags fly forever. So
yeah, he paid for it 3 years later, but who cared?
Yeah,
I think he won the first 2 years.
Well, that's really good. That's a good start to the league. So why don't we wrap up with maybe do you have 1 or 2 guys you're really going to kind of target in those middle or later rounds that you hope will break out, but maybe not everybody knows they'll break out?
Yeah, I got a few of them. One of the themes I noticed when we were writing the forecaster was that there were all of these pitchers. Obviously it was a great year for pitching in general, but there were all these pitchers who came out of nowhere as the season went along. Corey Kluber's kind of at the top of the list, but even a little bit further down, guys like on his same team, Carlos Carrasco and Dallas Keuchel and stuff like that. These pitchers who were sort of all to varying degrees out of nowhere, who put up to varying degrees really awesome years, particularly awesome second halves. And I was surprised by, sometimes you think like a half season performance, like you were saying earlier, we were talking about guys who need to have stable track records and everything, but you view those small sample sizes with skepticism. But looking at those metrics that I was talking about earlier, the swinging strike rates in particular, those guys all look really legitimate. So I'm curious to see how many of those guys are available at a reasonable price, because people are a little skeptical of them for the reasons we were talking about. But I kind of believe in a bunch of them. And another one who wasn't that good for too long, but Baseball HQ was really high on last year, is Danny Salazar from the Indians. And I kind of feel like we might have just been a year early on him. And I'm kind of drinking the Kool-Aid there. So the Indians have bulked up their rotation a bit, and it's not even 100% clear that he's going to make the rotation right out of spring training. But I'm okay with that because I really like that arm. He was blowing people away at the end of the year, and we were really high on him last year and got a little bit of criticism for it, but I kind of feel like we were just a year early.
Getting those guys that maybe the post-hype rookie, or in this case, just a guy that's maybe only 6 months early, those are great. And like you said, it's nice to draft guys that have a track record of 3 stellar years, but once a guy has 3 good years of stats, he's hard to draft. If you can draft a guy who only has 1 year, but you have a belief that that 1 year was far from a fluke, that really it was his true ability, then you can draft him while everybody else is searching for that guy that actually has 3 decent years.
That's exactly right. Another guy who I'm really high on coming into this year is Anthony Rizzo from the Cubs, who, I feel like a year from now, everyone's going to have him as a sort of consensus first rounder, one of the top first baseman in the game, top 5 pick, that sort of thing. This might be the last year where you can get him, a little bit cheaper than that. He was good last year, but he wasn't Jose Abreu or, Batista or, vintage Pujols. He wasn't that, that real true cornerstone, but I think he's about to go there. And this to me is the last chance to get him, a little cheaper than full value.
Right. I mean, if you're in a keeper league, you won't be able to draft him because I can't imagine anybody cutting him. But like I said, we're getting literally 300-400 trades a week. So all these comments, I know people sometimes listen and they go, oh, well, yeah, I'd like to have Rizzo, but I'm in a keeper league. Well, just because you can't draft him doesn't mean you can't trade for him. And I think you're right. If you call someone and say, I want to trade for Rizzo, you're not going to have to pay a king's ransom right now. I mean, you have to give up a good player. But I think you're right. If you do it in a year, they're just going to start laughing.
Yeah, and I tell you, that league I joined just last week, I'm calling Rizzo's owner, sometime before freeze lists are due. I'll guarantee you that.
And that's the other way you can kind of change your keeper team around, because like you said, once you keep 10 or 12 players, the tone of your team is somewhat set. But if you really decide, okay, I've tried to win for 3 years in a row with pitching, and this keeper team's never quite done it, this is the time of year to trade a couple of those pitchers for a couple of hitters. Because once everybody's kept their players, then your team is, well, not set, but it's kind of on a path.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's easier to, it's one thing to tweak on the margins or, in season, a lot of times your trades are about, plugging holes or, my catcher got hurt, I got to go trade for another one. But, this is the time of year where, like you said, you can completely turn the ship. And if you find 2 guys who, match up and you want to focus less on hitting and the other guy wants to focus less on pitching, or, I've got, sometimes with the player movement, I've now got, 2 shortstops, and there are all kinds of things you can do there. Or I'm short keepers, and, I've got 2 keeper spots that I might have to look to sell, but the guy who won the league last year has, 15 guys who are viable keepers. There's a lot of stuff you can do there.
Yeah, no, this is the time to trade. Well, it's been great talking to you, and as I've been telling folks for, well, as long as Scoresheet's been around, because that's how long BBHQ has been around, it is a great site for if you want to read as much or as little as you want about players. You can read as much as you want, or you can just grab a cheat sheet. You can talk in forums. There's all sorts of things you can do. And I'm sure we'll talk to you, or maybe your kind of co-managing director, Brent Hershey, will come on and in 4 weeks, and he'll tell me why he thinks Rizzo is going to flop this year.
Yeah, we're not a Borg, so that's entirely possible.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Ray. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Always a pleasure.
All right.